lunch speaker. Let me just start by acknowledging our sponsors for this next talk. The ENTs in town, Dr. Schuler, Anderson, Barlow, Bakazi, Mosinger, and Sidaway have sponsored this talk. So I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Ed Yates, who many of you will recognize and recognize his voice as well as his face. He's been doing 40 years of broadcasting. He got his BS and MS degrees at the University of Utah. He started in radio and then moved to Channel 4 in 1965. He began at KSL 5 in 1974 and has been covering medical and science stories in Utah here for KSL Eyewitness News for over 30 years. He's won multiple awards. A few examples is the National Association of Science Writers, National Society of Professional Journalists, National Association of Program Executives, American Association for the Advancement of Science, National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the University of Utah Achievement and Service to Journalism Award. He is married to former journalist Sherma Lind, and they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. So join me in welcoming Ed Yates.
Let me, if you will, go back to February of 2005, sort of set the stage here for some of the gee whiz things I'd like to talk about. KSL was about to receive what is called the Richard Headley Community Service Award from the Utah Cardiac Transplant Program. And my wife and I went to a downtown Salt Lake hotel to receive this award. And when we arrived there, there were no other media folk there, and so I went to the registration desk trying to find out what the protocol is, where I'm supposed to go, and so when I got to the desk, I introduced myself. I didn't say I was with KSL, I just identified myself by name, and the woman on the other side of the table said, "Are you a recipient?" And I said, "Well, yes, of course I am." And she says, "Well, then you need to wear this," and she gave me a little heart to wear on my lapel. And so we had about 30 minutes before the event started, the presentation, and so I mingled with some of the people out in the lobby, and they were all staring at my little heart on my lapel, and they would say, "Congratulations," and I'd say, "Well, thank you very much, I appreciate that." And and this went on with a number of people, and finally there was a gentleman in a wheelchair. And he said, "Well, my name is so-and-so." And I said, "Glad to meet you. My name is Ed Yates." And he said, "I notice you're a recipient." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, when did you get yours?" And I said, "Well, I'm getting it tonight." and he sort of reeled back in his wheelchair, and he said, "How can you possibly be here? What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm here because I'm a recipient." And anyway, this was a comedy of errors. It really was. And then we sat at the table for the dinner that night, and I noticed across the table there were 2 or 3 other people that had the hearts on. And I said, "I notice you're recipients." And they said, "Yes, notice you are too. Aren't you the keynote speaker as well, or aren't you receiving an award here tonight?" And I said, "Well, yes." And so I figured they were recipients in some form, and they said, "Well, no, we have received heart transplants. That's what this heart represents." And I was thoroughly embarrassed because I shouldn't even have been wearing a heart. I should have had a tag, but not the heart. And so you can guess what my opening remarks were when I got up to receive this award for KSL. And got as much laughter as I got right here. I mean, it was embarrassing, but it was one thing I remember. But I bring it up to set the stage because of how routine, even back in 2007, how routine heart transplants are. extremely routine. I mean, people talk about it openly. They go to dinners. They wear little hearts because they've all had their heart transplants and they're doing very well, and you can't tell the difference looking at one person, whether they've had a heart transplant or not. And it's a far cry from where we were in 1982, even though transplants were occurring back then. But let me just, if I can, just go back. Utah made history in 1982 when a dentist from Seattle became the first recipient of a permanent artificial heart. We have to keep making note of that even back then. It was not the first implant of an artificial heart, but it became the first permanent implant. The University of Utah mobilized for the event, setting aside one whole section of the downstairs cafeteria for the world media that was scheduled to arrive there. And so they really cordoned off a majority of the cafeteria and left very little for hospital employees and patients who were there to use. And inside that sort of cordoned off area, they had hookups for television and radio. They had all of the wire services in place, all of the places where professional journals, the writer of professional journals could sit and write their material. It was a massive undertaking for the U. And I remember all of the networks and regional stations all together in one location. We were actually at the back of the cafeteria. The cameras faced the audience and the podium here. And if you were standing at the podium and you looked at the back of the cafeteria, you would see some 20 cameras all lined up there. And that's where we would do our live shots. And I remember that as we would do these live shots, I was standing right next to ABC's science reporter, the network. And so I would be talking and he would be talking and somebody over here would be talking, doing their live shots, and you had to concentrate on what you were saying with an IFB in your ear so you could hear directions from your own director and sort of block out all of these other reporters who were all talking at the same time on camera because I was saying something different and doing something different than they were. So it was quite an experience, one of the first real international stories that I became involved with as a journalist. At the podium, Dr. Jarvik or Dr. Clark, not Dr. Clark, who was it? Dr. Chase Peterson would come down on the hour, every hour, and would bring everybody up to speed on where Barney Clark was in that event, in that transplant. In addition to Chase Peterson, there was Drs. Jarvik and DeVries, and a very young cardiologist by the name of Jeff Anderson in Salt Lake City, who was Clark's physician, and these folks would move in and out of the room along with the hourly appearance of Chase Peterson, make themselves available. On occasion, they would do interviews. I've got to say that though this was certainly an enlightened era in medicine, it was interesting philosophically how much urban legend was still embedded in this magnificent organ that we call the heart. Some within all the public observers of this event believed the heart was the soul, and if you removed it, you removed the soul. In poetry, the heart was the life-beat of love. When Unalloy Clark bent over her husband, moments before he was wheeled into surgery, Barney raised up as much as he could, and in soft tones asked his wife whether she could still love him without a real heart. The artificial heart then was large and noisy. In fact, one of the reasons the surgical team chose Barney Clark is because he had a very large frame. He had a very large chest size that would leave enough room to implant this plastic device. Many skeptics back then, questioning the wisdom of the artificial heart, the medical cost to society, its practicality in resolving the real issues of cardiovascular disease. And after his death, his widow, Unalloy, traveled the country speaking often about her husband, his pioneering effort, what he had achieved, the fact that he had really set the stage for what was to follow. And look what has followed. This is incredible, remarkable what has happened in just a few short years, and they have been short years since 1982. Synthetic assist devices patterned after that original heart now keep people alive and in reasonably good health until a real heart becomes available. And because of that artificial pump, when they do get a transplant, they're in better shape and they rebound faster from the hospital. We now have artificial hearts that are small enough to fit into the small frame of a woman and even into a child. I remember last year a temporary approval from the FDA allowing a small assist pump to be implanted in Cadence McCall Stevenson. She was a baby, dying, and would not have survived had the government not given Utah doctors sort of a special dispensation to use this European device called the Berlin heart. Tubes were hooked up to the left side of her own heart. The pump itself remained outside the body. The payoff? The assist device was removed weeks later after the baby had grown and regained more strength. Again, that device was removed, and her failing heart was then replaced with a donor heart. This is a little tiny baby. Like that pioneering effort with Barney Clark in 1982, these synthetic baby hearts are ready to move into clinical trials now in this country. Primary, in partnership with the University of Pittsburgh, will test a whole new generation of devices, including a Utah-designed heart that uses a magnetically suspended impeller to drive the pump. This heart does not beat, it hums. Generally, the prognosis for infants temporarily kept alive with these hearts is considered good. About half of them still have the heart they were transplanted with 15 years or more later. And it's not just infants. Adults, teenagers, hundreds have been kept alive on these synthetic pumps as holdovers. Some of the artificial hearts, as was the original concept with Barney Clark, have become a permanent fixture. In other words, these people are living, surviving on the artificial heart alone. They have no chance of having a heart transplant. But the heart is only one small story that I have observed over these years. The mapping of the entire human genome, the use of stem cells for regeneration and repair of body parts, this is the real future, shadows of science fiction that really are now becoming a reality. At the University of Utah, this is what really sparked my imagination as a science reporter. Newts with severed spinal cords are paralyzed. They can't move their hind legs or lower extremities. But 4 to 9 weeks later, the spinal cords have regenerated, regrown, so now those same newts are swimming and later walking again. The newts can do this because of some very unique genetic components that a newt keeps all through its life. What I didn't realize till I talked to the key researchers, and this research, by the way, was being funded by DARPA, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense, which is extremely imaginative sometimes in where they put their money. They put their money sometimes with researchers with very original concepts, just baseline concepts. It hasn't gone beyond that, and they invest their money in that research. Amazingly, we have the very same mechanism that those newts have, but we can only regenerate the spinal cord in the developmental stage while we're still in the womb. Neurobiologists hope they can find a way to reactivate those latent processes. If they can, imagine the possibilities. Researchers will be able to get a spinal cord to regenerate in an adult mammal. While the university was researching newts in 2007, researchers at the Mayo Clinic had successfully repaired damaged insulation around the nerves of a mouse by giving it low doses of a human antibody. That insulation, of course, as you all well know, is called myelin, and that's what's destroyed in multiple sclerosis. A successful experiment at Mayo, a beginning search for a genetic switch. In the science fiction movie Gattaca, a drop of blood from a newborn baby is placed in a device, giving the parents an immediate map of diseases or ailments the child will develop as it grows and more. Aside from the ethical implications in this move, the mechanism itself, if held within the bounds of privacy, has all sorts of possibilities. Enter USTAR researchers. They're working on a simple wellness card, like a credit card. From little drops of blood, you simply run it through a reader to find out what you have. So again, a prick of my finger, blood on a card, over a period of minutes could reveal a lot. Anything of interest, disease markers, viruses, cancers, bacterium, the list goes on. Rapid disease testing has the potential to read out everything at one time because it incorporates the same technology used to read data on a computer hard drive. It's also the same way you listen to tunes on your iPod. Now, use your imagination again. There's a little guy called a sandcastle worm that lives in a prototype tubular structure. It builds this thing by itself, all by itself, by reaching out with tentacles to grab bits and pieces of surrounding material. The worm sweeps the grains inward, applies a homemade glue, then adds this to his house. The glue is unique because it's carried in a water solution of molecules which works underwater to bond together wet substrates. The recipe that gives this glue these remarkable properties in water could also bond together shattered human bones, which in the body are also in a wet environment. Modified in the lab, Utah engineers believe the properties of this adhesive can be synthesized and perhaps applied via a syringe to injured bones without invasive surgery. The non-toxic glue would hold things together while the body makes a permanent repair, then it would degrade naturally. Cancer. Still very elusive. But through many of the genetic doors that are now being unlocked, researchers are learning how you can tap into the body's own immune system and help it recognize villains that up until now have disguised themselves. Cancer does its dastardly deed often by cleverly finding ways to convert the very cell the immune system has dispatched to penetrate a tumor. In other words, how to convert those cells to the bad side, much like Star Wars. But instead of traditional chemotherapy, how about an actual cancer vaccine that's injected just under the skin that alerts the body's own immune system to turn and attack the cancer? If you talk to someone like Dr. Randy Jensen, a neurosurgeon at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, this kind of therapy reactivates or wakes up those cells and lets them know, hey, this really isn't a normal cell. It really shouldn't be here in the first place. The cell then goes ahead and attacks and kills the villain just the way the immune response reacts to all the less elusive, more traditional villains we deal with every day. In the first clinical trials, the vaccine will be used only on brain tumors, but in theory, if it works, it might have applications for other cancers as well. Imagine, instead of a tumor growing and spreading throughout the body, the immune system identifies what up until now has been hidden markers on this cancer cell itself and then attacks and wipes it out. There's a challenge here, as in all of these early research events, to get the immune system to hype itself up in order to do this, but not to do it so much that it actually destroys itself when the war is over. Jensen believes this technique is really the future, but whether this particular way of doing it is going to be the end-all is still an unknown. Another clever killer that I've observed, and it might make a comeback in clinical trials, although in its early stages the pharmaceutical company that was doing this withdrew because of funding and never proceeded ahead with the trials, but they may come back now. Part of the problem here is that this was also an orphan drug. But it was one that blows up brain tumors like TNT. It was used only on 3 patients in the country, including Jared Swan from Idaho. In his case, the TNT was radiation molecules that the drug diffuses only to the tumor cells. Jared had numerous surgeries to remove as much of his brain tumor as possible. Every time it happened, Jared lost some of his cognitive skills. After about a year, he had lost half of his vision, and he was no longer able to talk. The Huntsman group used the so-called TNT approach to finish off the tumor after they had finished with these surgeries. Not far from his home in Ingham, Idaho, where we visited him last year, he now has a job, and he's been cancer-free for more than 5 years, and he's learned how to talk again. One last clever killer, the scorpion. This one really fascinates me. What researchers have found here is really quite ingenious. A small piece of the toxin appears to have some affinity for tumor cells. Again, attach a radiation molecule and let the piece from this ugly beast travel like a beautiful spear to penetrate only the tumor, so the collateral damage is minimal. Understanding how to parallel some of these natural compounds with natural mechanisms that already function in the body is the piece of the puzzle of healing that really needs to be unraveled. For example, researchers have long known about a type of white blood cell called the eosinophil. But what they didn't know is how rapid, almost chilling way that it works. Through all of our consuming of food, and I hope everybody's finished their dinner now, E. coli or some other invader makes its way to our gut. And if our immune system is not compromised, eosinophils explode, literally catapulting a net around the villains. In our digestive system, these cells form a pathway from the top of the stomach to the end of the large intestine. Though playing out microscopically, you couldn't make a movie with a more dramatic and heroic hero. The invader is caught off guard and snatched within a second. Dr. Gerald Gleich says it gets into the tissues, activates that eosinophil, and then the eosinophil casts its toxic net to capture, and kill the bacterium. Now, knowing how this mechanism works might lead to some new therapies for people who are underprotected, who are immune compromised, or an understanding of the bad side, and there's a bad side of the eosinophils, when they overreact, of triggering too much inflammation. But again, this is another one of those research projects where they're trying to basically understand a mechanism to see where that spins off from there. Some more amazing stories, if you will. Christine Miller is among one of the first groups of mothers that participated in a University of Utah experiment about 4 years ago. While 2,400 babies across the country were in the process of being born very preterm, and when we say very preterm, we're talking on the average of about 11 weeks early, their mothers were given intravenous magnesium sulfate or a placebo. In Christine's case, they started 12 hours after she had gone into the hospital, giving her 2 bags. Then they started it again as she was delivering her baby. Though 4-year-old Sandy now, her daughter that was born then, may have been at high risk for cerebral palsy, it never happened. Even after Sandy was born, her brain fluid was higher than normal, but still no cerebral palsy. She did have about a 7% higher amount of fluid than a baby her age would normally have had, but it wasn't enough apparently to cause worry. Magnesium sulfate has long been used to treat other pregnancy complications, we know that, but this is the first time that it's been used as a possible preventive for cerebral palsy. If magnesium does in fact stabilize vessels and protect against oxygen depletion and inflammation, it may just prevent or dramatically reduce the risk of this disabling disease that now afflicts an estimated 200,000 children in this country. Magnesium sulfate is far from a cure, we know that, and it may not work on all mothers all the time in the same way. But Dr. Michael Varney says this study, which shows a significant lower rate of all forms of cerebral palsy, will most likely now trigger a change in protocol, possibly this year. The predicted change, women at high risk for very preterm premature births would routinely get magnesium sulfate just as a safeguard. New techniques, invention after invention. I was talking here at the table a moment ago about tinker toy inventors and people who do things in their garage and start off with just some basic simplistic things, and lo and behold they spin off into some miracles 10 years later. Even modifying, and I talked briefly about this, something as traditional as the apple pie of surgery. 3 Utah doctors, Dwayne Westenskow, Joe Orr, and Derek Sakata, said there's just got to be a faster and less risky way to bring patients out of anesthesia after surgery. So they got together these tinker toy inventors, very simplistic kinds of concepts, and they came up with their own invention, a thing called the QED 100. Placed between the ventilator and the patient, the device lets the patient rebreathe their own carbon dioxide after surgery. A filter rapidly takes out the anesthetic while they're being hyperventilated. Why breathe CO2? I'm talking, I mean, you know, you're surgeons. I'm talking about things you're already aware of here. Carbon dioxide is important to increase cerebral blood flow to wash the anesthetic out of the brain, and that's exactly what this device does. The patient recovers fully from the anesthetic, not slowly in hours or even a day, but within 5 to 10 minutes. They are coming out awake, alert, they're not nauseated, they're hungry, they want something to drink, they're ready to go home within 30 minutes. It's a huge difference from where the anesthetic process has been traditionally. Again, started out as a basic idea. Three people get together and say there's got to be a better way to do it. And a lot of times that's where these things come from. Dr. Sakata says while the patient is under anesthesia, the device is not active, but when it's time to wake the patient, you simply flip the switch, turn off the anesthetic gases, turn up the flow, and away we go. And that's what Dr. Sakata says. And that's how simplistic the device works. It's remarkable here because what this does, it uses the body's own mechanism to get rid of the gases. There's no electrical wiring. There's no motors, no harmful chemicals. It's all natural. I could go on. I've just scratched the surface. I mean, there's been so many things that have fascinated me that it's like Pandora's box. The revolution in medical science just keeps pumping out ideas and concepts and hardware faster than I can observe them. I have to be cautious. That's the canons of journalism. You're supposed to anyway, although a lot of journalists don't worry about that anymore. But I have never been able to dampen my enthusiasm, even more so my optimism for where the future is taking us in medical science. But through it all, my greatest satisfaction still comes from the stories about people, the patients who fight disease and ailments, who live and die with incredible courage, who become the pioneers, who set the stage for others to follow. These are stories of survival in the face often of what appears to be unsurmountable odds. What I'd like to do now is show you a video that I put together here. This is just a sort of a condensation of things in summary form of some of these remarkable souls. A man from Idaho, not with one transplant, but multiple transplants that he got all at one time. The symbolism of a simple wall in a hospital and what it became to mean for the patients who wandered those halls. A family genetically stricken with brain tumors, not in one child, but child after child after child, and almost exactly the same kind of brain tumor. The genetic nightmare that every family fears and what every physician fears they're going to have to deal with. A Utah man who should have died but didn't. How many of these stories have you heard? You know, someone again who beats the odds, who has been written off but pulls through. A woman who should have died from a freak accident but didn't, based on the kind of accident she went through. And there's finally one of my favorites here, the healing of a boy with a rare disease that in earlier times would mark its victim as a wolf man or a wolf woman. A bizarre genetic disease in which hair grows on the body, the teeth turn black eventually as they grow into adulthood. They have all kinds of problems. And in earlier times, in less enlightened times, people who had this condition stayed inside during the day because the sun was a killer, would actually blister their skin, and they would come out at night. And when they would come out at night, they were covered with hair and they had black teeth, and so they were immediately labeled as wolf people. And, you know, if you want to really get into legend, you know, later as werewolves. But I included two of these summary stories of this boy because of his remarkable recovery. And you're going to see some repetition in it, but I have to repeat it because we did this at 2 different times, so we had to sort of refresh the audience on what we were doing. But the life for this boy completely turned around because of a bone marrow transplant. The odds were he would never make it, but he did. So anyway, I've saved that sort of for the last. So go ahead and you can watch some of these summary stories. We met Michael Pollard at his home in Burley, Idaho, almost 9 years ago. A rare disease was destroying his digestive system. There was a long shot, a monumental surgery in Pittsburgh where surgeons would transplant multiple organs at one time. They did just that, replacing his stomach, duodenum, small intestine, pancreas, and liver. Now 8 years following those transplants and still counting.
Prayer and a hope that I would get through the first year.
Michael weighs only 116 pounds. He's on oxygen most of the time, but he's alive, active, and drives to survive. Looking back to a trip to Disneyland with his wife and family in 2000.
I thought that was going to be the last. Event really have with my family.
In 2007, the end was near, or at least it appeared that way. Critically ill with pneumonia, Michael was flown by AirMed here to University Hospital in Salt Lake. He was at death's door.
To make a decision to take me off life support, thinking that I was going to go home and die at home, and then to turn around and come right out of that.
Remarkable, amazing, you fill in the blanks. For the Pollard family, yet another close call for Michael.
If anybody is prepared for my passing, they are. I mean, we've done it enough now, or tried to do it enough.
Michael's a grandfather now. He'd like to see 2 more of his kids get married.
You have to have faith. You've got to have faith. You know, when you have 5 kids and your youngest one is 2 and your oldest one was 15 at the time, makes you want to live to see a lot of things happen.
And happen they may as he continues savoring each day. Eric, a cancer patient, walks down the hall at LDS Hospital to write a message on the wall. It's a temporary wall separating patients on the 5th floor from a construction project. Bruce Dodders started the whole thing with one drawing and his name.
And one night I couldn't sleep, so I came up around 11:30 or so and spent 2.5 hours in the hallway.
We're not talking about some 6 by 8 foot wall. We're talking about wall after wall after wall, all filled with emotion, hope, humor, really poetry in its own right. We love you, Dad. Rest in peace. Live life to the fullest. Love everyone no matter what. Laugh at every dumb family memory. Cancer sucks. Hope. A patient here methodically wrote an ode to nurses.
Now that I'm bald, I can really see my face and my eyes. And they're beautiful, and I see my heart in them.
Brandy Chase lets her emotions flow. This is therapeutic.
But this is something that's happening to me, like really happening to me.
For nurses like Cammie Lemon and Megan Newman,
even for us as nurses, as we have a bad day, you can come back and look at the wall and just, it's inspiring to us. It helps us remember the good patients, the good times and everything. It's a healing wall all around for everyone.
You know, pretty inspirational. I'll be sad to see it leave, actually. It's been a way for them to say thank you to us as well.
these walls will go, but the experiment is far from over. In fact, after remodeling, the hospital will install permanent whiteboards to write on. This whole idea for expression and bonding has taken off. Somewhere inside you need to find peace between the warrior and the poet. 8-year-old Braxton, 3.5-year-old Caitlin, and 20-month-old Jaden have developed the same kind of life-threatening brain tumor at different times. Jaden was diagnosed a month ago. He's with his 12-year-old sister Kelsey here, who's the only one without the cancer.
The subtype of the tumor is very rare. The fact that it's familial is even rarer than that.
Dr. Carol Bruggers talks about a very rare subset of brain tumor called ATRT, which in its broader type makes up only 20% of brain tumors. But for the Williams family, they're dealing with a little-known subset of ATRT, which is even rarer. Then to have that same tumor hit 3 of the 4 children, for Colleen and Steve, that's overwhelming.
Totally blew us away because they told us it was so rare for our first one to get it, and to begin with, that we didn't think that it could be in our. And then when they did the genetic testing and told us that she was carrying the gene, we thought there's no way. A 3rd child, how do you do that?
Surgery for Caitlin, chemotherapy for her brother Jaden. 8-year-old Braxton went through surgery, chemo, and radiation treatments 4 years ago. His cancer is in remission, which by itself is unusual.
He's beaten the odds for what we know about this tumor, and he's beaten the odds for what we now know about what appears to be true for familial. He's older and he's alive and he's doing well.
I think Braxton is a positive effect on us because he's gone 4 years, so it gives us hope for all of our kids.
It's been nothing less than amazing.
Mike Smith was a man who kept dying, but those around him kept bringing him back.
Just having terrible chest pains and, grabbing at my chest and hurting real bad. And that's all I can remember out of it.
Following a massive heart attack at home, ER docs at the hospital in Delta shocked his heart 8 times. On life flight from Delta to Provo, he was shocked again numerous times. Still no luck, even after doctors opened the closed-off artery to his heart at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center. Mike is shocked again multiple times. Despite the jolts, despite medications, with low blood pressure and continuous fibrillation, the heart was shutting down. This is all that was left when he finally arrived at Intermountain Medical Center in Murray.
So he was transferred up here for mechanical support of his basically impending death.
One last attempt. A catheter is snaked up through his groin into the heart. It punctures a hole, so blood with oxygen can be pumped from one chamber to his brain and other vital organs through a device called the PVAD. Unlike many other heart assist devices that are planted inside the body, the PVAD, the pump itself, is placed outside the body in a strap just above the knee. Mike is packed in ice to cool down the body. The outcome? Not only has he recovered, his heart has repaired itself. It's pumping normally. The green line is healthy. There's no brain damage, no damage at all. The temporary PVAD, which allowed his heart to rest and heal, has been removed.
It's unexpected. Definitely, it's phenomenal.
In addition to PVAD, IMC is about to begin clinical trials on a new generation pump, but this one at 25,000 RPM is miniaturized right inside the catheter itself. But it's more than devices. Mike's back home because a lot of people over a 150-mile journey just would not let him slip away.
Second chance, and I get it because of the good people that were put around me. The first breath that was pushed into me.
Breathe deeply, Mike. The breaths are here to stay. 35-year-old Clancy Talbot is still in a lot of pain while the inside of her body begins a slow healing process. 11 days ago, she joined her friends and co-workers on ATVs for some trail riding up American Fork Canyon. She was a passenger in one of the machines.
When we went around the corner, there was like this tree. Half of it was in the road, half of it was still on the ground. So I saw it coming. There was nothing I could do.
The log went through the front plastic fairing on the machine and right into the cab and right through Clancy.
David Hall was in an ATV about 50 feet behind Clancy. When he got to her side,
there were numerous times where I thought she wasn't going to make it. In fact, I thought she was dead.
Clancy's stomach had exploded. The log had penetrated all the way through, shattering the rib cage and stopping the ATV only when it had reached the back of her rib cage. Luck seems to have favored Clancy through this whole ordeal. When that 4-inch diameter log or limb impaled her, it pushed this shirt, her shirt, all the way through. But then as the ATV backed off and the log pulled out, This shirt actually acted like a seal or a plug, probably reducing the bleeding. At first, cell phones didn't work, but suddenly out of nowhere, someone arrives. His phone gets out just long enough to reach 911 and get help. As they made their way down to a meadow and Lifeline,
She looked up at me and said, you know, Dave, I'm not going to make it. I'm dying. Tell my family that I love them. Tell my kids I love them. Tell my husband I love him.
Pat made repairs and sewed up what stomach is left. Clancy's been getting nourishment through an IV, not digesting food or water. That is until yesterday when she got her first drink.
It's definitely in God's hands. I could have been dead 20 times over. There's just so many different ways I could have been dead.
But with her husband and friends at her side, she's here and alive and ever so grateful. Nick was born with what is called congenital erythropoetic porphyria. Fewer than 200 in the world have this particular strain of the blood disease. Sun burns and blisters the skin almost immediately. Hair begins growing all over the body. Adult teeth come in black, not white. In less enlightened times, victims were believed possessed because they came out only at night. But talk of superstition, of ignorance, no more.
He's porphyria free.
And then just almost overnight, it just went away. Completely disappeared.
Physicians killed off all of Nick's old bone marrow cells, giving him new ones from a donor in early December. The transplant is working. Boils on the body have disappeared. The skin is clean. And he's gaining weight.
Very pleased. He tolerated this transplant great, and today he's doing as good as can be expected.
There were many times where I thought we were done, and I was just waiting, and that little guy just pulled right through and just proved me completely wrong. Nicholas is back.
Nick didn't talk much before, but now.
And he just flat tells us what it is that he wants. It's really different to be able to actually have a conversation with our son for the first time.
The disease is no more, but this 3-year-old boy is not out of the woods yet. Anti-rejection drugs designed to keep Nick from transplant leave him extremely vulnerable to infections. Bone marrow transplants have to be monitored carefully up to 2 years, sometimes longer. But for now, optimism here is running high for the rapidly approaching day when Nick can play in the daylight.
He's a miracle boy. He is just, it's the only words for it.
Nicholas Ashby stayed inside during the day with blinds closed because the sun burned his skin instantly. Playtime outside was at night. The 3-year-old boy had what is called porphyria, which by itself is rare, but the manifestation of what is called the GATA gene in his case was even more bizarre.
He, so far, is the only child in the world who's ever been described with this particular disorder. So even though it looked like this very rare disorder, it's actually a unique that he has.
Eventually, the boy's exposed skin would have been covered with full hair as a protection. Also, his adult teeth might have come in black. With that appearance, folklore in unenlightened times unfairly labeled the disease as a curse that turned humans into animals. Ridiculous. Now, back in his hometown of Orofino, Nicholas has crossed a bridge no one thought was possible. He's cured. At age 6, he walks with his parents in full sun, no blisters, the skin almost spotless.
He's growing like a weed. He's finally on the growth charts. He's talking. He's a brilliant little boy.
More than 3 years ago, Nicholas got a bone marrow transplant at Primary Children's Hospital, but after he went home, he relapsed 3 different times. Surgeons took out the and gallbladder on the last life flight to Primary. He was bleeding internally. It didn't look like he would survive the night. But then?
And the next morning, he sat up in bed. Doctor said there was nothing more they could do. And today, he's just started preschool 3 weeks ago.
4 months ago, he didn't have enough coordination to ride a 3-wheeled scooter, let alone 2 wheels. But look at him now.
Last weekend, he tore it up at the skate park. two-wheel scooter, and he tore it up like all the other kids. And I just sat there and I thought, wow, he's just like these other kids.
He's absolutely cured from all manifestations of the blood disease that he had.
Developmentally, he's behind about 3 years, but with the cure now, he just might catch up.
He's got life, and that was our goal. Our goal is to give him a normal life.
When he wraps his little arms around me and gives me a big kiss and says, "Mom, best friend," those are words I never thought we'd hear.
No drugs, not even an antibiotic, just a little blood pressure medication, and that's probably temporary.
Are you having fun outside?
Yeah.
Are you? Do you like to go outside?
Yeah.
Well, that's the payoff for all of you who are surgeons, doctors. For me as a journalist, in reporting some of these remarkable innovations and changes that are occurring in medical research, the real payoff comes with these stories. And these are just beginning. And what we are seeing now in medical research, imagine what we're going to see 20 years down the road. Let me just finish by just telling you that as of today, there was a clinical trial that began in Salt Lake City where they're using a catheter in the leg to come up into the heart and replace a heart valve. So they take the damaged heart valve and they do it via catheter. They don't open the chest. There's no heart surgery. It's all done, minimally invasive, takes about an hour. And imagine how fast the patient rebounds from this. This is the future for replacing heart valves and the future for doing a lot of other kinds of surgeries down the road as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We sure hope you continue to do your science medical stories for KSL, because we really need to hear those stories. So thank you very much again. We're going to start up at 2 o'clock with our afternoon lectures, so we've got about a half-hour break. Thanks.